Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Hanger DX, where we talk about everything developer experience. Today, we have with us Kaelig joining from Netlify, and I'm really excited to talk to Kaelig about everything front end and design systems. So, Kaelig, please start with a bit of your introduction.
Hey, my name is Kaelig. I am a developer at Netlify. I've joined 2 years ago, and when I don't work on the design team here and help 5 million developers make their development and deployments easier, what I'm doing is I lead and co-chair the design tokens community group under the umbrella of the W3C. And where we build standardization around data formats for exchanging data and design across tooling and code bases, etc. But we can get a bit more into it later.
So, tell us a little bit about you've also previously worked in Shopify. So, share a bit about developer experience at a large organization like Shopify versus sort of like a growth organization at Netlify. How does it differ? Like, what were some of the ways large organizations operate versus smaller ones when it comes to like front end developer experience?
Yeah, so when I was at Shopify, when I joined, I think the total number of people at the company were around 2,000. When I left, we were 10,000 and about 2,000 developers. So obviously, when you have that kind of scale and you have thousands of people working on a code base, on several code bases, you end up investing in platform engineering. So I was part of first the design systems team, and then I was working on front-end platform engineering and just trying to accelerate the developer experience for hundreds of developers. And at Netlify, we're kind of a special situation because although we're a way smaller team, we're about 200-ish people right now, and more than half of that is developers. What we're optimizing for is not just our internal developer experience, but the developer experience of about 5 million developers. And when you take it to that scale, it's another set of considerations. But yeah, so it's still DX, still doing platform DX, just on the end of as a platform instead of inside of a platform team for a big engineering team. So that's the biggest difference to me.
That's amazing. So, in a way, you're saying is when you think about DX at Netlify, you're thinking about both developer experience for your users, end users, as well as internal developers. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So obviously, we have our own developer loops inside of Netlify where most of the time we use Netlify to build Netlify. So that's one of the cool parts of the job. But yeah, a lot of the time when we want to build a feature that we think or we want to accelerate our own workflows, we look at could we even productize that? Is there a way we could make it available to thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of developers who are using the same kind of technologies we are? We try to use open source tech as much as we can. We try to use things that are pretty ubiquitous in the industry so that we can put ourselves in the shoes of those developers. And then whenever we make a change that benefits us, it also benefits our customers.
That's amazing. And you've been at Netlify for quite a long time now. Have you seen sort of like, your entire DevEx maturity evolve itself? Kind of like, maybe you can share a bit more about like evolution, where things were and where things are now in terms of the platform infrastructure for front end.
Yeah, I mean the whole team is DX focused from top to bottom of the organization. So I haven't seen any major changes in that kind of how people are really passionate about developer experience and saving people time and helping developers have more agency in their day-to-day work. So I wouldn't say I've seen any like major changes. I think what changes is the strategy. So a few years back, Netlify was very much geared towards solo devs, hobbyists, students. What else? Agencies and small e-commerce websites, small to medium, sometimes large content websites as well. And then as we're getting into a more mature platform, what we are attractive to is really big S&P 500 massive enterprise, massive companies that you've seen the logos of everywhere. And I mean, nowadays we host about 30 million websites, and a
Wow.
decent chunk of that is big traffic from some of our largest customers. So I'm super proud of helping those developer teams accelerate their workflows. So that's, to me, that's how we've evolved in terms of the customer base that we're targeting now.
Very cool. So, big part of this conversation, I would want to dive into design systems. I don't consider myself a front end engineer by any means. So, from that perspective, like, educate me. What does a design system mean? How does one organization or leadership of a company, for instance, think about design systems?
Yeah, so it's going to depend on who I'm talking to define a design system. If I'm talking to a marketing person, or if I'm talking to a developer, or if I'm talking to a designer, or an exec, because the design system has so many facets to itself. And in fact, our design system at Netlify is called Facets. But I think the best way to describe it for an engineer who's who's on the front line using the design system, I think the easiest way to describe it is it's the set of components that make it into the UI. It's the rules that say, hey, this is how we're going to write that label onto a button. It's the spacing that you're going to have between elements. It's kind of how you take the brand expression and put it into code, and then as a coder, get all the Lego bricks that you can to build UIs that are high quality and that respect that brand expression. So obviously, if I was talking to a designer or, like I said, a content marketing person, maybe I would use very different language. But I like to keep it simple for engineers and be like, hey, here's a bunch of Lego, and build UI with that.
So, from that perspective, when you think about components, are these sort of components written in code, or are these like components sort of like somebody designing it inside of Figma? Because part of the reason I'm also trying to figure out is from a layman terms, is design system that is owned by a design team? Is it owned by like a PM? Is it owned by engineering? Who really kind of defines a design system in an organization?
Yeah, all the above. so imagine you've got every single company is going to have some forms, some buttons, some typography. Typically, you're not going to have engineers just on their own build that stuff with no indication from design on how this should look and feel. So it almost always starts from a design perspective that is going to take maybe some brand expression, some brand rules, some brand guidelines. Behind me, I've got the NASA graphic design guidelines that explains in detail, like color, logo, how to apply it, etc. Across a lot of different platforms. At the time, there was not much platform aside from on the side of spaceships, I guess, which is pretty cool. The idea here is that you've got all these buttons. How do they look is going to be probably decided by the design team, how they are implemented by the engineering teams, and then if you're at a certain size, you're probably going to have a design system team dedicated to building the design system, evolving it, maintaining it, getting adoption across the company. They think of it typically like a product or a service or infrastructure, depending on the language that people like to use in their companies. And then imagine a design platform engineering kind of thing, where they take the design language, apply it, turn it into code, and then so you could have a PM on that exact team. That's all of the above that you were describing, essentially.
Interesting. So you're saying in a typical design system team, there will be a PM, there will be a designer, and there will be an engineer.
If you're lucky, you're going to have somebody who's at least acting as a PM if you've got that kind of scale. But it's very frequent that design system team is fractional designers and engineers who are doing that on the side of their desk because they think it's just making their workflows way better when working on UI and their work more efficient. I don't think we were put on this planet to draw rectangles from scratch and rebuild buttons and form elements every time. So there's this element of efficiency that developers know, like if you're going to reuse something a couple times or more than a couple times, then you probably want to have one source of truth for it. So that's what where the design system comes in. And then just like with any kind of SRE platform engineering team, if you're at a certain scale, you're going to have a product person. And I've seen some I mean, at Shopify, the SRE team had somebody acting as a product manager who was more of an engineering person with a big product mindset. But yeah, so same thing for design systems. You're even going to have people who are kind of focusing on the marketing of the design system. So that's, you can get in really big teams, you can get pretty deep into specialization.
Interesting.
It's not just one engineer, one designer, and one PM. It's like a slew of those people, an army of devs and designers and content people and marketing folks and even developer advocates on design system teams. So yeah.
Really? Wow. So this is definitely new world for me. How does it even evolve? Like, where does it start? So let's say if I were to say, a 10-person team company, right? Like maybe they have like, sure, 5 engineers, like a designer and a product manager. Who would like start thinking about a design system? Is there like sort of like, if you have an organization, sure, like there could be multiple people part of it, but who's kind of like driving it? Who's kind of like owning the system? Like who's like at the end of the day responsible for a design system?
Yeah, so if you're a 10 people team, chances are you have maybe one designer if you're lucky. And that designer is probably doing a bunch of marketing stuff and product stuff at the same time. And the way they can multiply their impact is to use a pre-made component library that is going to exist already, have a representation in Figma and in code, and then get the developers to use that code. And then whenever they build something in Figma, they know that they can have a almost one-to-one representation in code, so that what they imagine in Figma is going to take very little effort to replicate in code. And so it just makes their impact much better as a designer. And they don't have to reinvent the wheel every time they build something. And the developer team doesn't have to also code from scratch every single component, which is, if you have a go-to-market strategy that's pretty tight, as we know a lot of product and startup teams have, you don't want to have to build those things. So just taking off-the-shelf design infrastructure, as I would call it, and distributing it into the company, that would look like this. But if you're a way bigger company, you probably want to build your own solution because your brand has equity. And then if you invest in it and scale that brand, you want to have really high quality everything. You don't want to just take an off-the-shelf component library and just willy-nilly use that in your product, because your brand is going to be tainted by that off-the-shelf solution. So that's in terms of scale. You can have we can talk more about this, but for a small company, so that's how we would probably start. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. So is there like a good resource where people can find these component libraries off the shelf? Or kind of like, have you seen, I'm guessing there's also variants of it, right? Like kind of maturity wise. Where do you typically find these kind of things?
Oh, that's a good question, actually, because I haven't taken off-the-shelf component libraries myself in a really long time. I know that a very popular one is MUI, because it has a good set of Figma libraries and a lot of themes, etc. So people tend to take MUI for web stuff. And then if you have cross-platform presence, meaning let's say you have an iOS app, a web app, and an Android app, then we're starting. I don't know exactly, but I think there's probably stuff that exists out there that kind of helps you mix between native-ish feel on all of these platforms while expressing your brand. And so, sorry, I'm not going to be super helpful here, but I think MUI nowadays is a pretty well-known solution that people have been looking at.
That's very cool. So we'll definitely check it out. So another random question around this, right? Like, especially as people are start thinking about like design systems, Have you seen scenarios where people would possibly like even outsource somebody building a design system for them? Or do you think this is something
Yeah,
people have to build it in house?
yeah. I mean, I think that typically applies for larger companies, but and I haven't seen people building design systems for small startups in consulting manner. It might exist, but yeah, there's more and more contractors that are experts at this, and even agencies that just come in and train your teams, co-build the design system with them, do a lot of workshops, try to do a bit of adoption to kind of get you started on the right path, and then they leave you with a fully fledged design system, or at the very least a few components, and your team ready to build that design system for scale.
Interesting. So, okay, we've kind of like, got to a point, okay, people have started thinking in building design systems. Is there like a more, like an objective way to measure the maturity of design systems? How should one think about, like as a company grows and matures over time, that the design systems are sort of like keeping up? And is there like, things that people should worry about earlier in their life cycle of design systems, and things that people should just like not worry about in the early days?
Yeah, so for typically the first metric people use is adoption, because you start from nothing, and you want to prove that what your team is building is getting traction, and people are actually using it. Otherwise, what's the point? I don't know if it's a great metric for more mature design systems, but for the very start, I think it does its job. At least you're at the point where you're struggling to find even funding for your design system. So it's like whatever metric makes sense. And so to get a sense of adoption, what people do is that they measure how many components are being used in the UI. Another one kind of weird adoption metric that I quite like is during hackathons, I always look at how many projects have been using the design system versus not using it. And if people just reach for the design system, even in a hackathon, it means you've kind of reached good enough adoption that people know about it, people like using it, and they, even when given the choice, they would rather use that than another UI library. So kind of a cool way to hack a metric out of hackathons. And then further down the road, when you've got really good adoption, then you can start looking at how many contributors do you have, because you can run this like an open source project. What else? How many one-offs do you have in your app that should have been? So you can run an audit of your product or your various properties and look at, okay, how many things are using the design system that should not be using it. Sometimes that's the case, and because it's detrimental to the user experience, and people are overusing the design system. And then how many instances should be using the design system but aren't for like unknown reasons. And then you kind of do kind of backtrack, like take a step back. Why is this thing happening? And then try to understand all the company dynamics that led to that decision being made, and then you can adjust your design system strategy based on that. I know that some people are trying to, at a very large scale, to see with and without the design system, how long does it take to build a certain set of features. But there's so many things that happen during development that I doubt that this is easily implementable and trackable.
Interesting. I'm curious, is there like a sort of like is there a concept of gold standard in design systems, in the sense like, okay, we have achieved, like we got to this point that our design systems are now, like gold standard industry standards? Is there such a concept?
Well, I would say there's definitely an Instagram aspect to design systems, where people who share their design systems that are nice and perfect out there in the open kind of give a lot of FOMO to other teams who would love to have that kind of investment in design systems. So what I would say is each company should have a very different way of thinking about design systems, and looking at what those huge, massive companies are doing, or those teams who work in the open are doing, is probably not gonna. I mean, don't feel inferior because because of that. Because of course they're gonna have a better design system if they have 25 people or 50 people working on it, or sometimes hundreds. And so I would say there are some things out there that are particularly high quality. I'm thinking, I mean, IBM Carbon, for example, is just super high quality. They have some really good stuff in there. What else? Microsoft with Fluent, and I quite like what Oracle has been doing, although it's not super publicized. Atlassian also has amazing stuff going on, and so using those as inspiration, I think, is useful. But don't feel like you have to have the same thing, because like the investments are counted in millions and millions of dollars, sometimes tens of millions of dollars towards that, and so you probably can't have that unless you have a really big team. Um,
Interesting.
yeah, and I've been lucky to work on some of those really large teams as well, and not the ones that I mentioned, but it's um, yeah, it's very humbling when you go back to a smaller team, like at Netlify, where design system is not. We don't have a dedicated team to it, so it's it's a very different experience from going from 25 people on the design system to zero.
I mean, I think company size aside, where do you see kind of like, I mean, obviously, even in large organizations, not every large organization have a very, I would say, mature and structured design systems. So, where do you think is the difference? Like, I mean, arguably, many of the design things are also about creativity. But I'm curious, like, from maturity perspective, do what part of design systems is actually like creativity and like the art aspect of it versus more objective like engineering aspect of it? Like, how do you think like large companies generally like differ in this?
Yeah, well, so actually, it's a really good question, because the maturity levels, you can see design systems teams that when they're done struggling with adoption, they've got good adoption. Now they're like, okay, how do we enable creativity and expression in the product? Because the first thing is to tame the chaos. There's so many different buttons. There's so many different ways that the brand is expressing itself, that you need to put some order into that. And once you've got order, maybe there's too much order in some areas. So you need to undo the design systems work to say, okay, in this area, we need to allow for more expression. And so how do you do that? And so that's where you see design systems teams being very mature, is when they have that kind of thought process. And furthermore, I would say that the um, the advent of design tooling, not just engineering tooling, has been amazing over the past few years, with extensible platforms such as Sketch plugins, and which have been around for a while. But I think Figma also really democratized that, where you can build tooling directly inside of your design tools, that then help bridge the gap between design and engineering, because those folks can speak the same language at all stages of the production. So to me, that is a big change, and big design systems teams will take advantage of that and create specific tooling just for their needs, inside of Figma, inside of their front end tools, and you see that more and more. Atlassian is one of those pioneers who have been building like amazing tooling since for the past 8 to 10 years, maybe more. So they were very much in advance of the rest of the industry, and yeah, it's very inspiring to see.
Interesting. And do companies at that scale, like Atlassian, for instance, and even Shopify that you worked at, do they have multiple design systems, or is it sort of like just one for the entire organization?
Yeah, well, typically what you see, and that was true for Shopify as well, is that you're going to have a brand system that is ubiquitous across the company. So those are like the tenets that should be kept true, and that's going to be things like the logo, some typographic kind of typesetting rules, and then you're going to have a lot of subdivisions in the company, and it's not necessarily super efficient to have one UI component library that is used to do everything there. You're gonna have multiple tech stacks. You're gonna have multiple sub specializations of some products, some verticals that might need totally different brand expression. And so, if you're building on the one side a checkout page, for example, and on the other side an enterprise software billing backend, those two things should probably not use the same components, because all of a sudden you've got the checkout, which the brand expression should be the brand expression of your customers, so that when you go onto the checkout, you feel like you're still in the same shop that you were shopping on. But the kind of enterprise billing management settings should probably not be looking like the customer. It should probably, or the merchant, it should probably look like Shopify in that sense. And so the needs are very different. And so to me, when there's different audiences, different needs, it's a good time to think about having multiple design systems, and having teams work in isolation almost. I don't think you need to have, that much shared knowledge between all of them. And if along the way there's convergence that comes naturally, then I think it makes sense. But I've seen too many teams trying to build a one system to rule them all, and then kind of go away from that because it was too hard to maintain.
Actually, yeah, speaking of maintenance, once a design system exists in a company where, sure, like most number of components are already in the system, what is a typical day-to-day maintenance like? I mean, are most of the folks in the team generally building more components, or is there more to it?
Well, first of all, people are going to discover bugs, a lot of them, and so you've got to fix them. And then you're going to have accessibility initiatives. So it's very rare that the first version of a UI component library is going to be fully accessible. And then as the company matures and you invest more into accessibility to just do the right thing and also avoid lawsuits, you end up fixing those accessibility bugs. And another thing is that design language might evolve, so you're going to have to roll a rebrand out at some point. I've seen companies do that every 2 years, and so then design system teams is very involved in doing that. And another thing is a lot of dependencies of let's say you're building a UI library in React. You're going to have a lot of dependencies out of that UI library. You got to keep your UI library up to date for security and performance reasons. And yeah, so just maintaining that is quite a lot of work. And then you're going to have new components that some teams are going to be asking for, or another thing that it's not really seen as maintenance, but I think it kind of is. It's you can create some sort of support org inside of the design system team that might be rotating set of engineers and designers who go help other teams to solve their UI and UX problems, and then bring that knowledge back to the design system, and then that creates evolution of the system. So lots of gardening work to do.
So I would love to go back to early days of people designing design systems. What are some of the common mistakes that you've seen people do, or kind of like things people should avoid when they're just getting started?
Yeah, I mean, I was talking about the FOMO earlier on. I think over the past few years, there was a lot of hype around design systems, and everyone wanted to have a design system team. And I think a design systems team is a means to an end. But what is the leverage of that team? And so is my big question here. Like all these people are going to be tasked on working on infrastructure instead of product. So if you're mature, you have product market fit, or you're scaling and you're hiring a lot of people, great, do that. Like invest in infrastructure. It's going to help you deliver faster and better on the long term. But if you're short-termist and you're not sure what the next 6 to 12 months are going to look like, maybe it's not a great idea to put your eggs in that basket. So I've seen, especially over the past few years, some companies overinvest into design systems. And as a design systems advocate, I would say it's kind of a weird thing to say, but you can have a design system that is not built by a design systems team. And so The tooling nowadays is so great. You can build in ways that is supportive of a coherent system without needing an entire team to support it. So, yeah, that's to me that's for people who start, that's one thing. And then another mistake that I see all the time is people building the design system with no stakeholder approval, and just doing that on the side of their desk and burning out because they've done their normal job, and on top of it did the design system, and seeing no high fives from anyone in leadership about that design system. It's like, why why is there no recognition there? So trying to get some exec sponsors, or at least leadership sponsors, to support that initiative, I think is super important. And yeah, not building in isolation and in a vacuum. And sometimes you want to be a maverick and just go for it and just build it. That's fine. But there's a long tail of things that you subscribe to when you build a component library or you build a design system. And maybe you didn't realize that it was going to take way more than just the first initial push. And then how do you get funding for all these things that you can't, your leadership doesn't recognize? So yeah, that's a big one.
So that brings us to like our DevEx question, right? Like we are obviously a podcast on focused around developer experience, and kind of like also goes into design system, right? Like if we have to work with or like get the stakeholders involved, get the leadership involved, how should one person or a collection of group, some people who are interested in building design systems, how should they go and convince the leadership? Like how do you kind of like even explain the impact of developer experience on design system?
Yeah, well, it depends what people are valuing in your leadership. But one of the ways that I like to position it is that good ideas can come from anywhere. And so if you remove the barriers between developers having an impact to customers, you're going to see ideas come to life, or at least get prototyped in a like first of all much more often, because people will reach for these easy to use tools to build stuff that they wouldn't have been able to. And then you're just gonna get so more of it, and then more often, and so more ideas going to in front of the eyes of lots of stakeholders, and that applies to developers who might be a backend dev who doesn't necessarily want to touch or doesn't necessarily want to specialize in UI, but all of a sudden they're being given a set of really well documented principles and Lego pieces that are off the shelf. They can just pick it up, build what they had in mind, and then they always have somebody they can tap on the shoulder to ask, hey, how do I do this with the design system? And then similarly for designers who know enough HTML and CSS and JavaScript to be dangerous, but are not super confident about venturing into the code base, all of a sudden they can build stuff not just in Figma, but also design in the browser, because they have access to that set of components that are exactly the same names as the ones that they use in Figma. So it's a very, very familiar environment for them. So lowering the barrier of entry not only helps backend and developers, but also designers. And then obviously front-end devs, like the last thing you want to be doing in your in your day-to-day is to rebuild that freaking button for the 70th time. It might be fun when you're just starting off and you want to experiment with multiple ways of building buttons, but at some point you're like, no, this is not good. And so you have a lot of companies also that don't have the luxury of investing into a lot of front-end devs and having product teams being short on front-end devs, but still able to deliver features is kind of amazing. I mean, the velocity you gain is awesome. So that's one of the ways to sell it. I mean, sometimes you just have to find that exec that really cares about design and really cares about efficiency, and is going to speak that the love language of other execs and maybe the board to get them to invest in that initiative.
Amazing. All right, Kaelig, I know we are at time, but I would love to also at least go through some of the rapid fire questions with you and wrap it up with that. Are you ready for this?
Let's go.
Okay. So, what are you most excited about in the DevEx in the coming years?
How AI can reduce our workload and repetitive tasks, so we can do more creative stuff.
That's amazing. So, I guess it goes into AI as well. What is your take on Copilot or like any kind of coding assistance?
Yeah, amazing. Using it for the past few months, it's gone from writing 20% of my code to about 80% right now, and I'm just super happy about it. Like the amount of tests and such that it writes for me is just better quality code, but just all around. So love it.
Amazing. So, other than coding assistants, have you seen any interesting use cases of LLM?
Yeah, stuff that is really hard to do unless you have a PhD in ASTs and understand trees and such. So just automating that stuff for you, like big changes across many code bases. So I'm thinking about code mods, and so there's a lot of cool companies around it right now. So I'm just very excited for that.
That's awesome. And being kind of like in the DevEx space for a long time, what do you think is the skills that makes a good DevEx engineer?
Thinking about other devs and you yourself in 6 months is and taking yourself out of trying to appear smart, but instead lowering the bar and making things really easy to use and fast. That's so having a kind of a UX mindset when doing developer stuff.
Interesting. Are there any go-to tools that you go for focus on DevEx?
Go-to tools. Good question. I mean, aside from ChatGPT nowadays and Claude and various other things, not really. No, I think the tools I use come from UX generally. That's the stuff that I like to use. So anything to go experiment directly in Figma and start brainstorming ideas in Figma and all that. I just love getting teams around that, even engineers.
Awesome. And last question: are there any books that you recommend that you really enjoy reading?
Ooh, I mean, if someone is starting in that field, just read the DevOps Handbook. It's just so short and to the point. And then I would say there's a bunch of podcasts that I'm not much of a long book reader, but there's so many podcasts that are just amazing about this. I know HeavyBit had some, and obviously yours, but there's there's quite a few that are just talking about SRE and developer experience. And then there's a few design system podcasts, so I can't recommend enough the one from Knapsack. And so it's called the Design System Podcast, I think. So just go and
Amazing.
listen to that.
I'm gonna at least like link some of them in the
Mm-hmm.
show notes so people can find it. So with that, Kaelig, thank you so much for your time. This was a pleasure talking to you, learning so much about design systems and understand the world a little bit better.
Anytime.
Yeah, thanks for your time. Have a good day.
Thank